Listen closely and do not blink, because this is the kind of secret that rearranges what you think you know about bloodlines in place. The photograph you are about to inherit shows two infants lying in a wooden crib, their features wrong in a way that makes the brain pause and reorder its assumptions. The room where they were born fell silent, not because of absence but because something in the air recognized an otherness it had been waiting for. When a midwife with decades of births behind her says she nearly ran, she is not being dramatic, she is registering a violation of the rules that govern life. The Parish family were stubborn people tied to the land who made choices with the weight of secrecy. They chose concealment over explanation because some truths invite intervention, and intervention exposes what a bloodline may want to keep private. You need to understand the context. The farm had roots that ran deep into county memory. They buried photographs in metal boxes, they buried names in empty coffins, they created a private archive of absence, and that archive became fertile ground. The twins Thomas and Sarah were kept away from town. They existed in the upstairs bedroom like relics preserved from a language the outside world had forgotten. Neighbors accepted the story of stillbirth because grief is a shield, and the family had learned how to wear it fluently. But the longer the secret stayed in the room, the more the room became an instrument. The twins developed at odds with anatomical expectation, and in that mismatch a pattern emerged, a gestalt that suggested preparation. The family doctor visited after dusk. He spoke in low measured tones. He kept a journal and later burned pages because some entries could not be carried into daylight. Margaret Parish recorded nights when the twins woke and stared at each other without blinking, as if listening to a frequency only they could hear. She wrote about simultaneous cries across rooms, about refusal to eat alone, about soft spots that pulsed like small drums when a sibling stirred. This is where the story shifts from biological oddity to structural hazard, because what a family cultivates in private eventually shapes collective possibility. Listen now, because the first descent has begun, and what follows will ask you to decide which is worse, concealment or discovery, and it changes everything. Now that you have the photograph lodged in your mind, we move deeper into the house and into the pattern that grows there. You must understand how small choices compound into irreversible outcomes. The Parish family cultivated isolation like an expert gardener tends a poisonous plant. They taught their children silence as method and secrecy as virtue. Neighbors saw curtains drawn and accepted sorrow as explanation, and sorrow became a cloak for the unnatural. Medical visitors came and left uneasy notes that were burned or hidden because exposure was a threat to what the family valued most. Record by record, the narrative was erased until absence itself became evidence of trust. Inside the farmhouse, rhythm replaced language. The twins developed symmetrical motions that read like ritual to those who watched them closely. Margaret recorded patterns in a journal she hid under floorboards, patterns of breathing, synchronized tapping, and objects arranged with careful repetition. Daniel's arrival did not disrupt the choreography, he completed it, and the family read completion as prophecy. When attention focuses on a child like a beam, it alters the child's behavior, and what you watch grows in proportion to your gaze. Power here is subtle and cruel. Attention curated by adults becomes the curriculum of the young. Remember this always. Now this is important because the physical world amplified the family's internal program and gave it material persistence. Outside authorities came with ordinary frameworks and failed to see the extraordinary dynamics because the behaviors fit narratives of poverty, religion, and eccentricity. This mismatch bought time and secrecy until the night that would not be contained. The discovery was not a singular shock but the end point of accumulated concealments and rituals. Once the door opened, the legal system had to decide what counted as crime, what counted as culture, and what counted as madness. Investigators faltered because evidence had been dissipated through careful omission, and because those who arrived felt the weight of a story that did not belong to them. This is the place where institutional failure and private conviction meet, and the collision leaves survivors to carry consequences alone. Hear this now like a warning, not a comfort. The slow machinery that produced the Parish outcome is active elsewhere in forms you may not expect, and the next part will take you further down into how the family turned protection into prison. Descend with me into the basement where patterns lived and the small cruelties became doctrine. Listen and note the mechanisms that convert private grief into public silence. The Parish household taught conformity like scripture handed down in secret chapters. Children learned the vocabulary of obedience long before they learned letters. They learned precise times to rise and precise tones to use with elders. They learned to eat when commanded to eat and to look away when ordered to look away. These rituals function as training devices shaping attachment and erasing doubt. Power operates by making the abnormal habitual so habit becomes invisible. Margaret S. journals record the layering of rules, the slow accumulation that makes resistance impossible. Outside observers saw scarcity or devotion but not the deliberate machine of control. Neighbors accepted explanations because social norms rewarded privacy and punished curiosity. Professionals failed because the system was designed to appear as sorrow or eccentricity rather than criminality. This is an institutional blind spot, and it is lethal because it allows harm to calcify. The twins were both the proof and the glue of the system. Their bodies attracted attention, and their treatment taught the family how to respond to attention. They were sheltered and anonymized and elevated to talismans that enforced secrecy. Then Daniel arrived and altered the dynamic by functioning as an amplifier of learned behavior. Children observe and imitate faster than adults realize, and imitation turned into coordination. Coordination became ritual, and ritual became belief. The family cultivated a culture where asking for help equaled betrayal and silence equaled loyalty. That cultural logic is a form of social engineering, and it was practiced daily. The consequence is that abuse becomes normalized and complicit. The community erases its duty to intervene. If you study these cases, you will see repeating signals. Curtains that are never drawn, empty school records, unexplained absences, adult narratives that frame intervention as harm. These are red flags, not anomalies. Prevention requires institutions to treat privacy as conditional and always subordinate to the safety of children. Intervention must be informed by curiosity, not by judgment, and by persistence, not by convenience. Remember this, because the next section will cover how escape was planned, how patterns cracked, and how truth leveraged a single brave act into exposure. Hold steady for the fracture that follows the confession, and watch how hidden systems collapse today. Now this is the fracture moment, where secrecy begins to leak and one small act detonates 100 hidden rules. Listen as I guide you through the design, the fear, and the decision that turned private ritual into public record. Daniel studied pattern and routine until the house revealed its seams. He watched door checks, meal times, and the way adult eyes glazed at predictable intervals. He learned which keys were habitually left near the hearth and which curtains never fluttered in wind. He learned the language of habit and used that grammar to carve an exit for two people raised to be obedient. Escape required more than sneaking, it required breaking the story that justified silence. He had to remove the sacrament from the altar and show it for what it was: cruel governance dressed as devotion. So he gathered the ledger pages, the unsigned entries, and the photos hidden in envelopes. He copied names scribbled in margins and cataloged graves that had no public record. He memorized phrases Otto used to command obedience, and he photographed margins at night under a lantern to avoid wakeful eyes. Timing became everything, and his moment came when illness and ritual occupied the same room and defenses thinned. One winter morning he walked into town with a packet that smelled of old paper and fear, and he found one desk where truth could start. He placed the photos, the notes, and the ledger on a table and spoke calmly until an investigator stopped laughing and started listening. Warrants were issued, children were taken into care, the manor was searched, and the ledger that had changed generations was finally examined. The public process was ugly and clumsy, and humane missteps happened, and mercy and suspicion tangled together. If you are moved by this now, do something small and symbolic and anchor your intent with words. Comment, I choose truth twice to mark your decision and to show the algorithm that intent matters. This act is not ritual, it is witness, and witness is necessary if we want institutions to act with evidence. Revealing a secret is violent in one sense and liberating in another, and you must be ready for both outcomes. What Daniel did was practical. He chose proof over silence, and he paid for it with fractured family bonds and a lifetime of memory work. But he also delivered a path for those who came after, a way to break cycles that had been protected by wealth and tradition. They opened the ledger in a courthouse room, and the town watched as the paper breathed out names. Investigators followed patterns that looked like ritual disguised as domesticity, and they cataloged concealment as evidence. Clinics gathered, and the language of policy tried to translate trauma into procedures. Psychologists wrote reports, and priests issued statements, and administrators debated liability. Children were separated to break the chain that had taught silence as survival, and social workers built plans to teach speech again. Some children relearned laughter slowly, and some could not find steady ground after years of enforced stillness. Journalists wanted villains and the courts supplied a few, but the deeper truth was how neighbors cultivated inattention as peace. Archives showed entries labeled consent that read like coercion, and the state discovered gaps where law and custom overlapped. Legal cases produced settlements that required secrecy and made many question whether justice equaled memory or erasure. A group of survivors demanded a different path. They wanted truth to be careful and communal rather than sensational and punitive. They worked with therapists, historians, and lawyers to reconstruct timelines and to build protections for other vulnerable families. Hospitals adopted new protocols, and social services trained workers to spot ritualized control masked as religion. Academics published papers that examined how isolation and ideology co-create systems that thrive on secrecy. In kitchens and church basements, neighbors who had once looked away began to speak in small, honest sentences about warning signs. Power pushed back with lawyers and delays, but steady care emerged from volunteers who tutored and visited and learned how to wait. The man who exposed the ledger never returned to old comforts, but he watched children learn to trust their voices again. This chapter did not end with a single verdict. It extended into policy and practice and the slow, hard business of repair. If you are following the descent, what matters now is not only how we uncover but how we mend and how we refuse to forget. Survivors created a registry of at-risk children and a living memorial where names could be read aloud, not sealed behind redaction. Communities funded education and hotlines, and a small museum collected artifacts so memory could teach rather than haunt. The goal was to turn secrecy into stories so future watchers would act before silence hardened into harm, and accountability became practiced daily. You followed clues to the edge of the map, and now you must learn what happens after exposure when silence fractures and history demands a price. This section examines aftermath and ownership and the slow, brutal work of repair. It is about the human cost and the institutional cost, and how both are measured imperfectly. First, the witness carries a private ruin that never fades. People who saw and did not act live inside a quiet corrosion that changes how they sleep and how they look at their children. They carry rituals of avoidance, and sometimes they pretend nothing happened to survive socially. Next, the institutions arrive with forms and neutral language, and they translate horror into policy that fits inside a binder. Reports are written and footnotes are filed, and the words often sanitize what was obscene. Hearings convene and experts testify, and the survivors sit as if on display. Compensation is offered like closure, but money cannot unlearn suffering. Therapy is allocated in block hours, and bureaucrats check boxes to declare a case complete. But survivors understand that healing is not transactional. Healing requires time and presence and persistent witness from people who will not allow the story to disappear. Community repair begins in kitchens and basements with neighbors who refuse to look away any longer. Grassroots groups form to educate and build safety networks. Counselors share techniques for ritual trauma and create shelters. Educators change school protocols so that children who show signs of extremity are noticed and helped early. Historians document what was hidden, and artists render the unsayable into images that force confrontation. The legal system sometimes catches up, and small statutes change how neglect is defined. These incremental changes can prevent another life from being stolen, and survivors accept that slow reform is still reform. There's also the moral repair that comes from testimony. When a survivor speaks, they remove a talisman from the house of secrecy, and the wound can no longer feed on darkness. This speaking is dangerous, and it often costs reputation and peace, but it is necessary to redistribute power. Finally, there is a choice for you, the listener. You can watch and do nothing and let silence keep reproducing itself, or you can carry a piece of witness forward. To carry witness is to read the records and teach the patterns and insist that institutions act now openly. You have reached the last descent, the final chamber where witness becomes obligation and the story of the Parish family becomes something larger than a single case. Stay with this, because endings in dark history are never clean. They unfold like old paper cracking along creases that were folded decades earlier. Here we look at legacy memory and the strange gravity of silence. The parish ledger is gone, sealed, archived, and eventually restricted, but its influence persists in the children who survived it and in the systems that failed them. Legacy is not the past, it is the pattern the past teaches forward, and those patterns can be interrupted only by people willing to recognize them in real time. Understand this now: the conditions that allowed the parish family to operate did not vanish. They reappear whenever communities treat privacy as sacred beyond question, and when institutions allow ideology or discomfort to override responsibility. Dark history does not repeat through monsters, it repeats through ordinary people choosing ease over witness. This is the quiet lesson survivors want recorded. Survivors teach us to notice the curtain always drawn, the child who never speaks, the neighbor who avoids every public space. They teach us that intervention is not cruelty and asking questions is not betrayal. Inquiry becomes protection and doubt becomes the tool that saves lives. Now look at the terrain beyond the farmhouse, because this is where story becomes mandate. Researchers study these cases to chart behavioral signatures, patterns in speech, posture, ritual, and withdrawal that indicate a child is repeating an inherited script rather than developing freely. Social workers revise protocols to address collective denial as a measurable risk factor. Journalists learn to investigate without exploiting and to center survivor control over narrative. Teachers receive training to catch early signs, and medical professionals learn to question stories that feel rehearsed. This is the ecosystem of prevention, a network built from everything learned here. But legacy does not rest only on systems, it rests on you. What you choose to remember alters what can happen next. When you pass the story along, you deprive silence of its preferred environment, darkness. Stories like this prevent repetition when they are told accurately, without spectacle and without forgetting the people inside them. This is the last step. Listen carefully to understand the weight now. Take what you learned and carry it into your own world, so no child grows in a house where silence becomes law and secrecy becomes inheritance.